This new audio update with patch 16.5 has had some dramatic implications for sound, and it even adjusts the order of the headsets too that we've come to depend on from earlier versions. Today we're revisiting the usual tests that I do when something changes, but also looking more deeply into what actually makes a headset good, and ultimately whether it even matters anymore. So let's get the basics out of the way first and look at the ranges from top to bottom on the best headsets to the worst headsets. I tested the usual 12 along with no headset at all, excluding the integrated Contact 5s and 6s that fit with some specific endgame helmets because they're just not ever used. And in previous tests, they've been exactly the same as the regular Contact 5 and 6s. Charting them all out, we can already see a serious increase in the range of headsets compared to the beginning of this wipe, which was probably the shortest range that we've ever seen in Escape from Tarkov for hearing. Listening to another PMC running underweight with the Contact 6s has gone from 50 meters up to 71. The M32s from 44 to 64 meters, and no headset at all from 38 meters to 54. This represents around a 40 to 45% increase in the volume range in general. For underweight running, I tested every single headset to get an idea of the range from top to bottom, and the list has shuffled around a little bit, with the GSSHs jumping up to about halfway because they're so loud versus a headset like the Razer, which has fallen all the way to the bottom because that one in particular is super quiet. This doesn't tell the full story though, because the GSSH has downsides in other areas such as ambient reduction. As usual from this point, it takes so long to test every single headset that I looked at the other move speed types based on the best headset, the Contact 6, versus the best budget headset, which I personally think is the M32s, as you can buy these straight away at level 1 traders. Underweight walking used to be almost exactly the same as underweight running, but now there is a relatively decent distance between the two, because although running got boosted by about 45%, the walk distances only increased by about 30%. This makes our walking ranges 64 for the Contact 6, 59 for the M32s, and 47 meters for no headset at all. For the other move speed types, the ratios between them is about the same as it was in the previous version, just including this audio range bump overall. So slow walking is now at 34 meters versus normal walking at 64, so it's about half the distance where it starts to become audible. Crouching with Contact 6s, moving at full speed, is now 21 meters, which is nearly half again what the slow walk distance is, and the slow crouch at 12 meters is almost half again that of regular crouching. So the gap between the best headset and the good budget headset is still not actually that big, the largest gap being related to running, where we get around a 7 meter advantage using the Contact 6s over the M32s. This honestly isn't a deal breaker in most situations. But although these ranges are a bit different to how they were before, at least to my ears, and it's worth remembering that all of these audio tests have some element of subjectivity to them, it tells us nothing about the ambient reduction that each one provides. Testing in perfect silence from all other audio sources gives us a result that is theoretically correct, but not necessarily practical. Unfortunately, trying to get a good measure of each headset's ability to remove background audio when outside is extremely difficult because the wind comes and goes in various strengths. Getting an accurate baseline outside of recording tons of audio for each headset is not really practical, so to get a rough idea I used the indoor audio instead. This is significantly more consistent than the outside audio and doesn't have all sorts of other random sound effects mixed in there as well, but obviously it has a slightly different profile. Needless to say, this should give us a good idea of how much of the background each headset can suppress. Both the Contact 6s and the rack headset came out as the best here with minus 59 decibels. Remember, in decibels, the more negative a number it is, the quieter that sound is, which in this case means less background noise was recorded, i.e. the headset is better at removing it. Most of the other headsets were somewhere in the middle, with some very slightly better and some very slightly worse, but one massive outlier was the GSSH, with its background audio nearly 10 decibels louder than the Contacts. Now, here's where things get a bit interesting. In previous tests, I've always wondered whether this was the best way to judge the headsets overall, as although publishing the best to worst hearing range list and the ambient reduction values is technically correct, this doesn't necessarily correspond to those that are most useful in an actual raid. For example, what if the GSSH's higher ambient volume is a symptom of all sounds through that headset being higher in general? To try to get to the bottom of this, I ran a couple of new tests that I haven't done before at a fixed distance instead, and found some surprising results. The first test was a series of suppressed M4 shots at two fixed distances, the first at 50 meters and the second at 90. You can't do any more than this because the shots disappear after 100 meters as usual with a suppressed gun, but these are two realistic sounds that you might hear at these distances in raid. While all of the shots were similar-ish in volume, there is some variation, in particular the Razers being quite a bit quieter than the others, as I mentioned before when we saw the distances. The two loudest headsets for the 50 meter shots were actually the Contact 5s and the GSSHs, which is not entirely unexpected based on my suspicions from before, but it's certainly interesting. At 90 meters, the two loudest again came out as the Contact 5s, but then this time it was the M32s alongside it. I'll pop up the chart of this full series so you can see the ones that did the best and those that did the worst, bearing in mind that they are all fairly close. For each one, I took the peak decibels relating to the sound of the gunshot, which does vary slightly depending on exactly which gunshot sound is used, but it was relatively consistent for each headset. However, we still have the binary issue of hearing in Tarkov. Often what matters is not the volume of a sound, just whether we can hear it at all or not. There is certainly a threshold below which it is hard to tell if a sound was a real sound or if you were just imagining it, but once you get adept at recognizing which sound is which, things like gunshots from 90 meters you'll only miss if there's other similar audio happening at the same time, like unsuppressed scav gunshots. At this stage, I was starting to get a bit suspicious that the differences between the headsets, outside of the footstep distance and generic EQ adjustments, could simply be down to overall volume. This next test certainly didn't help. Here's two clips of a player walking with different headsets on and listening to the player's own footsteps. There's clearly a big difference in the volume of the two clips, but when boosted to the same level, they sound remarkably similar. Given our data before, you probably could have guessed that the first clip was the GSSH and the second was the Contact 6s just from the overall volume, but they really do sound very alike at the same overall audio level. So to give my suspicions one final attempt at coming to some sort of performance-based conclusion, I decided to test another very commonly heard audio cue, another player aiming down sights. This one often gives people away, although only plays at close ranges, somewhere within the 20-meter mark. The issue with it? It's really subtle. In fact, it's so subtle that my very crude audio analysis fails to deal with it properly. Most of the time, the ADS sound effect is actually quieter than the background audio, even with a decent headset on. But we as a player can still hear it. Why? Well, the brain is a remarkable computer when it comes to sound, and can often pick out things of interest amongst other louder, uninteresting sounds, and this is no different in Tarkov. I'm going to play two more clips, and I want you to decide which ADS sound is easier to hear. Both clips have been boosted by the same level on each, just to make it easier to actually hear in more casual settings when watching this video, but I can just about hear the ADS sound in these on my own system without the boost. So clip number 1 is the Contact 6, and the second clip is the GSSH. Maybe this confirmed your guess, or you disagree, but I think that the Contacts are arguably easier because of the lower background, and the ADS noise itself isn't louder by enough of a margin to make a difference on the GSSH. Here comes the crux of the issue, signal to noise ratio. All that matters really is one sound relative to all the others, so at this point we have to resort to looking at the spectrum of the sounds themselves to explain what we're hearing and try to quantify it a little bit more. The audio profiles of the clips look something like this. What this chart does is basically unpack the sound and separate it out into different sections. Along the bottom we have frequency, so low sounds like howling wind and background hum end up further on the left, and high tinny sounds like steps, gunshots, etc. end up further on the right. The background noise for the GSSH on its own in a windy environment already has quite a lot going on, but when we swap to the spectrum of a short clip with the ADS sound in, this adds in some additional sounds from about the 2000 Hz mark and higher over the top, which is what your brain is picking out and telling you that someone just aimed their gun. But as I said, this effect is pretty subtle, and when we look at the same two charts for the Contact 6s, we can see that the change between the two spectra is a lot more pronounced. In this situation, the Contact 6 gives a better signal to noise ratio, i.e. the sound that we're interested in is more pronounced against the backdrop than it is for the GSSH. Given everything we have seen in this new set of testing, I still think that the higher quality headsets with greater levels of ambient removal are better overall, given their larger audio range for footsteps and the chance for a higher signal to noise ratio for subtle audio cues that you might miss with a less well tuned headset. Ultimately, personal preference comes into it a lot as well, as we're not only dealing with EQ preferences from the in-game headsets, but an actual volume change between them too, as well as how it interacts with our own headphones and ultimately our own ears and brains, which might be better tuned to one EQ profile versus another. So as always, it's worth testing a few of these technically better ones across the spectrum of early game up to end game and deciding which couple you get on with best, as when the game wipes for example, you'll not be able to buy Contact 6s and have to make do with something else like the M32s. So as usual, a big shout out to all my patrons, and as always, have fun in your raids.